The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as James Mitchell adjusted his red uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. 23 years he had served as a royal guard, watching over the British royal family with unwavering dedication. His boots clicked against the stone pathway as he made his way to his assigned position outside the palace gardens. James had seen it all during his service. Countless ceremonies, state visits, and family gatherings. He had stood silent and motionless through summer heat and winter cold, always maintaining the dignity and discipline expected of the Queen's Guard. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. At 51 years old, James was one of the most experienced guards in his unit. His colleagues respected him, and the royal family knew him by sight, though interactions were always formal and brief. He took pride in his work, understanding that he was part of something much larger than himself. Protecting the monarchy meant preserving centuries of tradition and history. As he reached his post near the Rose Garden, James noticed unusual activity in the palace. Staff members were preparing for what appeared to be an informal family gathering. This wasn't marked on any official schedule he had seen. Young Prince George, now 10 years old, would likely be among the family members present. The boy had always caught James's attention during previous encounters, not because he was disruptive, but because of his remarkable awareness of the people around him. The morning air carried the scent of blooming flowers as James assumed his position. His rifle rested against his shoulder, and his expression settled into the familiar mask of professional composure. He had perfected this stance over decades of service, becoming almost statue-like in his stillness. Tourists often tried to make him smile or react, but James had learned to look through them rather than at them. What James didn't know was that this particular morning would challenge everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and human connection. The young prince had been observing the guards for weeks, noticing details that most adults overlooked. Prince George had developed a theory about the men who stood so perfectly still, and today he planned to test his understanding of their humanity. The palace grounds grew busier as the morning progressed. Kitchen staff hurried past carrying trays for the family breakfast. Gardeners tended to the meticulously maintained flower beds. Security personnel conducted their regular perimeter checks. Through it all, James remained motionless, his eyes scanning the area with practiced efficiency. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and James caught a glimpse of movement from one of the palace windows. Prince George appeared briefly, looking down at the courtyard with an expression of curious concentration. The boy seemed to be studying the guards' positions, making mental notes of their routines. There was something purposeful in his gaze that made James slightly uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. As the clock tower chimed 10 o'clock, James settled into what he expected would be several hours of routine duty. The family would likely emerge for their morning walk through the gardens. He would maintain his post with perfect discipline, and the day would proceed according to established protocol. He had performed this same routine thousands of times before, but sometimes the most ordinary days become extraordinary in ways we never expect. Sometimes a single moment of human kindness can shake the foundations of everything we think we know about ourselves and our place in the world. James Mitchell was about to discover that even the most rigid traditions could be transformed by the simple gesture of a 10-year-old boy who saw beyond uniforms and protocol to the person underneath. The palace doors opened with their familiar heavy creak, and the royal family began to emerge for their morning activities. James watched from his peripheral vision as Prince William and Catherine appeared first, followed by their children. Prince George walked slightly behind his parents, his hands clasped behind his back in a manner that seemed unusually formal for a 10-year-old. As the family approached the garden area where James stood guard, he noticed Prince George glancing repeatedly in his direction. The boy's expression was thoughtful, almost calculating, as if he were planning something. James had observed many royal children over the years, and they typically showed little interest in the guards beyond occasional curious stares. This felt different. The family paused near a fountain about 20 meters from James's position. Prince William was pointing out various architectural features to his son, part of the boy's ongoing education about the history and significance of their home. Catherine knelt down to adjust Princess Charlotte's jacket, while Prince Louis chased a butterfly that had caught his attention. It appeared to be a perfectly normal family moment, the kind James had witnessed countless times before. But Prince George wasn't paying attention to the architectural lesson or his siblings' antics. Instead, he kept stealing glances at James, as if trying to gauge something about the guard's state of mind. The boy had been thinking about this moment for weeks, ever since he had overheard a conversation between his parents about the dedication and sacrifice of the palace staff. James maintained his stoic expression, but internally he was growing more curious about the young prince's behavior. The boy seemed to be working up courage for something, taking small steps in James's direction while pretending to examine the nearby flower beds. Each step was calculated, deliberate, as if Prince George was approaching some kind of important decision. The morning sun climbed higher, and James felt its warmth on his uniform. His training had taught him to ignore physical discomfort, weather conditions, and distractions. Standing motionless for hours was second nature to him by now. But something about Prince George's persistent attention was beginning to penetrate his professional armor in a way that surprised him. Catherine called to her eldest son, asking him to stay closer to the family group. Prince George nodded obediently, but continued his slow migration toward James's position. The boy seemed to be fighting an internal battle between following his parents' instructions and pursuing whatever plan he had formulated. His young face showed remarkable determination for someone his age. As Prince George drew nearer, James could see the boy's eyes more clearly. They held an unusual depth of understanding, a maturity that seemed beyond his years. The prince wasn't looking at James with the idle curiosity of a child observing a curiosity. Instead, his gaze held recognition, as if he saw James not as a uniformed fixture but as a human being with feelings and needs. The distance between them narrowed to just a few meters. James could hear Prince George's soft footsteps on the gravel. Path could sense the boy's nervous energy as he approached. Whatever the young prince was planning, he was clearly gathering his courage to execute it. The moment felt charged with possibility, though James still had no idea what was coming. Prince George stopped directly in front of James, close enough that the guard could see the determination mixed with compassion in the boy's young face. The prince looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond his 10 years. For the first time in his decades of service, James felt truly seen by a member of the royal family, not as a piece of palace furniture, but as a person worthy of individual consideration. The boy opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to reconsider. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small. James's eyes flickered downward for just a moment, breaking his trained forward gaze. What he saw in the prince's hand would change everything he thought he knew about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of service. In Prince George's small hand was a simple bottle of water and what appeared to be a handwritten note. The boy's fingers trembled slightly as he held these items, and James could see that this gesture meant something profound to the young prince. This wasn't a childish whim or a moment of rebellion against protocol. This was a carefully considered act of kindness. Prince George looked up at James with eyes full of genuine concern. "I noticed you've been standing here for a very long time," the boy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you might be thirsty." The simple words carried weight that seemed impossible for someone so young. In that moment, James realized that Prince George had been observing not just the guards' routines, but their humanity. The guard felt something crack inside his chest, a wall that had been built over decades of training and discipline. No one had ever acknowledged his basic human needs while he was on duty. Guards were expected to be invisible, to endure discomfort without complaint, to sacrifice their personal comfort for the security of others. But here was this 10-year-old boy, future King of England, seeing him as a person who might simply be thirsty. James wanted to respond, to thank the prince for his kindness, but his training held him frozen. Royal guards were not supposed to break character, not supposed to engage in conversation, not supposed to accept gifts or favors while on duty. The protocol was clear and had been drilled into him for over 2 decades. Yet everything in his heart was pulling him toward accepting this gesture of pure human compassion. Prince George seemed to understand the guard's dilemma. "It's okay," the boy said softly. "I asked my father about this. He said that kindness is always the right choice even when it's complicated." The prince placed the water bottle and note gently on the ground near James's feet. "You don't have to take it now if you can't, but it's here when you need it." The young prince's words revealed something remarkable about his character and upbringing. Despite being born into extraordinary privilege, he had been taught to notice and care about the people who served his family. His parents had clearly instilled in him a sense of responsibility toward others, an understanding that true nobility came from how you treated those around you, regardless of their station in life. James watched from his peripheral vision as Prince George stepped back, not waiting for a response or acknowledgement. The boy understood that accepting thanks might put the guard in an impossible position. Instead, he simply smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had done the right thing, regardless of whether it was appreciated or even noticed by others. The note, James could see, was written in careful childish handwriting. From his position, he couldn't read the words, but he could see that Prince George had taken time to craft a personal message. This wasn't a spontaneous gesture, but something the boy had planned and prepared for. The thoughtfulness of it was overwhelming. As Prince George began to walk back toward his family, James felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. In 23 years of service, he had received medals, commendations, and official recognition for his dedication. But nothing had ever touched him as deeply as this simple act of recognition, from a child who saw past his uniform to the person underneath. Catherine noticed her son returning and smiled at him with obvious pride. It was clear that Prince George had discussed his plan with his parents, and they had supported his desire to show kindness to the palace staff. The family's values were being passed down in the most beautiful way possible, through actions rather than words. The water bottle sat on the ground near James's feet like a small miracle. The simple plastic container represented something far more valuable than hydration. It was proof that he mattered, that his service was seen and appreciated, that his humanity was recognized even in his role as a human statue. As the royal family continued their morning walk, Prince George looked back once at James. The boy's expression was peaceful, satisfied in the way that only comes from doing something purely good for another person. He had no idea that his small gesture was about to transform not just James's day, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve with honor and dignity. The next hour passed like a lifetime for James. The water bottle remained at his feet, a constant reminder of Prince George's extraordinary gesture. Every few minutes he found his eyes drifting down to read what he could see of the handwritten note. The careful letters spelled out words of gratitude and recognition that no guard had ever received while on duty. As the royal family disappeared around a corner of the garden, James was left alone with his thoughts and the simple gifts at his feet. His throat was indeed dry from standing in the morning sun, and the offered water seemed to call to him. But taking it would mean breaking protocol, and James had never broken protocol in over 2 decades of service. The internal struggle was unlike anything he had experienced before. His body craved the water, but more than that, his heart craved the connection that accepting the gift would represent. Prince George had seen him, really seen him, and had responded with pure compassion. To ignore that gesture felt like rejecting something sacred. James thought about his own children, now grown and living their own lives. He had missed countless family dinners, school plays, and bedtime stories because of his dedication to the royal family. He had always told himself that his sacrifice was worthwhile, that protecting the monarchy was a noble calling. But when was the last time anyone had shown him the kind of pure kindness that Prince George had just displayed? The sun climbed higher, and James felt sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was suffering from thirst while a solution sat just inches from his feet. But it wasn't really about the water anymore. It was about what accepting it would mean, about allowing himself to be human in a role that demanded he be a statue. Around him, the palace grounds continued their daily rhythm. Gardeners worked quietly among the flower beds, careful not to disturb the guards' concentration. Tour groups passed in the distance, their guides explaining the significance of the various buildings and traditions. Life moved on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but James felt as though his entire world had shifted. He began to think about Prince George's words about kindness always being the right choice. The boy had spoken with such certainty, such moral clarity. It made James wonder if his rigid adherence to protocol was actually serving the royal family's best interests, or if it was preventing him from embodying the values they were trying to teach their own children. The note at his feet seemed to glow in the sunlight. James could make out phrases about appreciation and recognition, words that acknowledged not just his service but his humanity. Prince George had taken the time to write something personal, something that recognized James as an individual rather than just another uniformed guard. The thoughtfulness of it was staggering. As the morning progressed, James found himself thinking about the future king who had just shown him such compassion. If Prince George could grow up maintaining this level of empathy and awareness, what kind of monarch would he become? Perhaps the future of the monarchy lay not in rigid tradition, but in the kind of human connection the boy had just demonstrated. Other guards had begun to notice James's unusual situation. From their distant positions, they could see the water bottle and note at his feet. Some looked puzzled, others concerned that he might be in some kind of trouble. But James felt no shame about what had happened. Instead, he felt a growing sense of pride that he had somehow earned the recognition of someone so special. The weight of his rifle seemed heavier now, not because of its physical mass, but because of what it represented. For years, he had carried it as a symbol of his dedication to duty above all else. But Prince George's gesture had introduced a new element into his understanding of service. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply acknowledge the humanity in others. As the clock tower chimed 11, James made a decision that would change his life forever. He looked down at the gifts Prince George had left for him, and for the first time in 23 years of service, he chose compassion over protocol. The water bottle called to him not just with the promise of relief from thirst, but with the possibility of accepting the love and recognition he had never allowed himself to receive. With movements that felt both terrifying and liberating, James slowly bent down and picked up the water bottle. His hands shook slightly as he broke the seal and brought it to his lips. The cool water was the most refreshing thing he had ever tasted, not just because his throat was dry, but because it represented acceptance of kindness he had denied himself for decades. As he drank, James picked up the note with his free hand. Prince George's careful handwriting spelled out words that would be burned into his memory forever. "Dear Guard, thank you for keeping our family safe every day. I see how hard you work and how long you stand without moving. You are a hero to me. I hope this helps you feel better. Your friend, Prince George." Tears that James had held back for years began to flow down his cheeks. In his entire career, through all the ceremonies, commendations, and official recognition, nothing had ever moved him like these simple words from a 10-year-old boy. Prince George hadn't just seen his service. He had seen his sacrifice, his dedication, and his humanity. The implications of what he had just done began to sink in. He had broken protocol in front of the palace, where security cameras and other guards could witness his actions. His superiors would want explanations. There might be disciplinary action, possibly even dismissal from the service he had dedicated his life to. But for the first time in decades, James didn't care about the consequences. Something fundamental had shifted inside him. The rigid wall between duty and humanity that he had maintained for so long had crumbled in the face of a child's compassion. He realized that he had been serving the monarchy for years without truly understanding what it meant to embody the values they represented. Prince George had shown him that true nobility lay in recognizing and caring for others. As James stood there holding the empty water bottle and the precious note, he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly to see Captain Morrison, his commanding officer, approaching with a serious expression. James had served under Morrison for 8 years, and he had never seen the man's face show anything but professional composure. Now, however, there was something different in the captain's eyes. "Mitchell," Captain Morrison said quietly, stopping a respectful distance away, "I saw what happened." James prepared himself for the reprimand he knew was coming, but the captain's next words surprised him. "In 30 years of service, I've never seen anything quite like that. The young prince specifically asked his father if he could approach you. Prince William gave his permission." The revelation that Prince George's gesture had been approved by his father added another layer of meaning to what had occurred. This wasn't a child acting against protocol. This was a family teaching their son about compassion and human dignity. The royal family had chosen to prioritize kindness over rigid tradition, and they had used the moment to teach their future king about true leadership. Captain Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to an even quieter tone. "The prince also asked his father to make sure you wouldn't get in trouble for accepting his gift. Prince William said that any guard who would refuse such a gesture from his son wouldn't be the kind of person he'd want protecting his family." The captain paused, studying James's emotional state. It seems you've made quite an impression on the young prince. James felt his world reshaping itself around this new understanding. The royal family hadn't just tolerated Prince George's act of kindness. They had facilitated it. They had seen value in breaking protocol to allow for a moment of genuine human connection. This suggested a vision of monarchy that was both traditional and revolutionary, one that honored service while recognizing the humanity of those who served. "Sir," James said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I've never experienced anything like this in my 23 years of service. That boy saw me, really saw me, in a way that no one ever has while I've been on duty." He looked down at the note still clutched in his hand. "I don't know how to process what this means." Captain Morrison nodded slowly, his own expression softening. "I think it means that the future of the monarchy is in very good hands, Mitchell. And I think it means that you've been doing your job better than you realize. Children see things that adults often miss. If Prince George chose to show you such kindness, it's because he recognizes something special in your service." As the two men stood together in the palace garden, both felt the weight of a moment that would change everything they thought they knew about duty, service, and the true meaning of loyalty to the crown. The days following Prince George's gesture were unlike any James had experienced in his career. Word of what had happened spread through the palace staff, but not in the way he had feared. Instead of criticism or mockery, James found himself receiving quiet nods of respect from colleagues who had served for decades without receiving such recognition. From the royal family, Captain Morrison had delivered an official message from Prince William expressing gratitude for James's years of dedicated service and acknowledging the positive impression he had made on Prince George. The prince had specifically mentioned his appreciation for guards who could maintain their professionalism while also embodying the compassion and humanity that the royal family valued, but the most profound change was happening within James himself. The experience had forced him to confront questions he had avoided for years. Had his dedication to duty cost him too much of his humanity? Had he become so focused on being the perfect guard that he had forgotten how to be a complete person? Prince George's simple act of kindness had opened a door he hadn't even realized was closed. James began to notice things he had overlooked for decades. The way other staff members struggled with long hours and difficult conditions, the sacrifices made by security personnel who stood guard through all weather conditions, the quiet dedication of housekeeping staff who worked tirelessly to maintain the palace's grandeur. He realized that he had been so focused on his own duty that he had failed to see the humanity in those around him. The note from Prince George had become his most treasured possession. He carried it in his jacket pocket, a constant reminder of the moment when he had been truly seen and appreciated. But more than that, it had become a symbol of the kind of person he wanted to be, someone who could balance duty with compassion, service with humanity. 3 weeks after the incident, James made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He requested a meeting with Captain Morrison to discuss his future with the Royal Guard. The conversation that followed would determine not just his career path, but his understanding of what true service meant. "Sir," James began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to say, "I've been thinking about what happened with Prince George, and I've come to some conclusions about my service and my life." Captain Morrison leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to be shared. "That young boy showed me something I had forgotten," James continued. "He reminded me that being a good guard isn't just about following protocol perfectly. It's about being the kind of person who deserves the trust that's been placed in us. I've spent 23 years being an excellent guard, but I'm not sure I've spent enough time being a good man." Captain Morrison studied James's face, seeing a depth of reflection that spoke to fundamental changes in the guard's perspective. "What are you saying, Mitchell? Are you considering leaving the service?" James took a deep breath before responding. "I'm saying that I want to find a way to serve that allows me to honor both my duty and my humanity. Prince George taught me that the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. If there's a way to continue serving the royal family, while also being the kind of person who would make that boy proud, then that's what I want to do." The captain was quiet for a long moment, processing not just James's words but their implications for how the guard service might evolve. "The royal family has been discussing changes to how we approach palace security and staff welfare," he said finally. They're interested in creating roles that acknowledge the full humanity of their staff while maintaining the highest standards of service. What kind of roles? James asked, feeling hope beginning to build in his chest. Training positions, mentorship roles, positions that would allow experienced guards to help shape the next generation while also serving as liaisons between the security staff and the royal family. Positions that would recognize that our best guards are not just those who can stand motionless for hours, but those who understand the values and principles they're protecting. James felt something settle into place inside his chest, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced in years. This was the path forward he had been searching for without even knowing it. A way to honor both his decades of faithful service and the lesson in humanity that Prince George had taught him. "I would be very interested in exploring such opportunities," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "That boy changed something in me, sir. He reminded me that the best service comes from the heart, not just from discipline and training." 6 months later, James Mitchell stood in a completely different capacity within the palace walls. He had been appointed as Senior Training Coordinator for the Royal Guard, a newly created position that combined his decades of experience with the insights he had gained from Prince George's transformative gesture. His new role involved training incoming guards not just in protocol and security procedures, but in understanding the human values that underpinned their service. The training facility where James now worked was a far cry from the solitary posts he had maintained for over 2 decades. Here, he worked with young men and women who were beginning their careers in royal service, helping them understand that true excellence came from balancing unwavering dedication with genuine compassion for those they served and worked alongside. On this particular morning, James was preparing for a special session. Prince George himself, now 11 years old, had asked to speak to the new trainees about the importance of kindness and recognition in service. The boy's request had come through official channels with full support from his parents, who continued to encourage their children's understanding of the human cost of royal service. As the trainees assembled in the lecture hall, James felt a familiar nervousness. Not the anxiety of standing guard during state occasions, but the deeper concern of someone who wanted to honor the profound lesson he had learned from a 10-year-old prince. He had told this story dozens of times now, to new guards, staff members, and anyone who would listen, but each telling felt as significant as the first. Prince George entered the room with the quiet confidence that had become his trademark. At 11, he showed even more of the thoughtfulness and awareness that had led to his gesture of kindness 6 months earlier. He greeted James with a warm smile and a firm handshake, treating him not as a servant but as a valued colleague in the work of maintaining the monarchy's highest ideals. "Thank you all for your service," Prince George began, addressing the assembled trainees with remarkable poise for someone his age. "I asked to speak with you today because I want you to know that your work is seen and appreciated, not just by my family, but by everyone who benefits from your dedication." The young prince went on to explain how he had learned to notice the palace staff, to understand their sacrifices, and to recognize their individual humanity. He spoke about the importance of kindness in leadership, about how the strongest institutions were built on foundations of mutual respect and genuine care for one another. "When I gave Mr. Mitchell that bottle of water," Prince George said, looking directly at James, "I wasn't trying to break any rules. I was trying to follow the most important rule of all, which is to treat others the way you would want to be treated." He had been standing there for hours, keeping my family safe, and I thought he might be thirsty. The simplicity of the statement belied its profound impact. Several of the trainees were visibly moved by the young prince's words, understanding perhaps for the first time that their service was valued not just professionally, but personally by the family they protected. James stepped forward to conclude the session, his voice steady but filled with emotion. 6 months ago, I thought I understood what it meant to serve the royal family, he said. I had spent over 20 years perfecting my ability to stand motionless, to be invisible, to sacrifice my comfort for duty. But Prince George taught me that the highest form of service isn't about becoming invisible. It's about being worthy of the trust that's been placed in you. He looked around the room at the young faces before him, seeing his own younger self in their eager expressions. Your job isn't just to protect the royal family from external threats. Your job is to embody the values they represent, to be living examples of honor, dignity, and compassion. When you do that, you're not just serving the monarchy, you're serving the best of what Britain can be. As the session ended and the trainees filed out, Prince George approached James one more time. "Mr. Mitchell," he said quietly, "thank you for showing me that kindness matters just as much as courage. You've helped me understand what kind of king I want to be someday." James felt tears forming in his eyes, not tears of sadness, but of profound gratitude. A simple gesture of human kindness had transformed not just his career, but his entire understanding of service, duty, and the connections that make us truly human. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply see another person, really see them, and respond with an open heart. In the months and years that followed, the story of Prince George's gesture would become part of palace legend, passed down through generations of guards as a reminder that true service always begins with recognizing the humanity in ourselves and others. And James Mitchell would continue to carry the prince's note in his pocket, a reminder that the best lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers, and that kindness once given and received has the power to change everything.